Case 1. Dwayne Buck's death penalty case became one of the most controversial capital punishment cases in the United States because race was directly mentioned in a courtroom decision about life and death. Dwayne Buck was convicted for a violent crime that happened in 1995. On that day, Buck went to the home of his former girlfriend, Deborah Gardner. During the incident, Gardner and another man, Kenneth Butler, were killed. Buck was arrested, charged with capital murder, and later found guilty. In 1997, a Texas jury sentenced Dwayne Buck to death. At first, his case looked like many other death penalty cases in Texas. What happened during the punishment phase of his trial, however, made his case very different. After a person is found guilty of capital murder in Texas, the jury must decide whether that person should receive the death penalty. To make that choice, jurors are asked to answer a key question. Is the defendant likely to be dangerous in the future? During Dwayne Buck's sentencing hearing, lawyers called a psychologist named Dr. Walter Quijano to testify. Dr. Quijano spoke about factors that might affect future violence. During his testimony, he told the jury that Dwayne Buck was more likely to be dangerous in the future because he was black. This statement was not based on Buck's personal actions alone. It linked race itself to violence. Even though Buck's own defense team had called the expert, the statement stayed in the record and became part of what the jury heard before choosing death. This moment caused deep concern years later. Race should never be used as a reason to decide whether someone deserves to live or die. Many legal experts, judges, and civil rights groups said that the testimony introduced unfair bias into the courtroom. They argued that it planted an idea in jurors' minds that being black made someone more dangerous. That idea had no place in science or law. Despite this, Dwayne Buck remained on death row for many years. He lived under a death sentence while his lawyers continued to challenge the fairness of what happened in his trial. Dwayne Buck's appeals slowly moved through the court system. His legal team argued that his constitutional rights had been violated because the jury heard racially biased testimony during sentencing. They said this violated his right to effective legal counsel and a fair punishment decision. For a long time, lower courts rejected these arguments. Buck stayed on death row while similar cases involving the same psychologist were quietly corrected by Texas. In several other cases where Dr. Quijano gave similar testimony, the state agreed to new sentencing hearings. Dwayne Buck, however, was denied the same relief for years. In 2017, Dwayne Buck's case reached the United States Supreme Court. The court ruled in Buck's favor. The justices said that the racial testimony caused real harm. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote that suggesting a person is more dangerous because of race is especially damaging in a death penalty case. The court ruled that Buck's lawyer had been ineffective for allowing this testimony and that Buck was entitled to a new sentencing hearing. This ruling was important not just for Buck, but for the entire justice system. It sent a clear message that race must never play a role in deciding punishment. After the Supreme Court ruling, Dwayne Buck was removed from death row while the case returned to Texas courts. In October 2017, Buck accepted a plea agreement with prosecutors. Under the agreement, his death sentence was replaced with life in prison without the possibility of parole. After spending more than 20 years on death row, his sentence was officially changed and he was transferred to a different prison unit. Before we proceed to the next case, if you enjoy watching true crime videos, this is the right channel for you. I post interesting videos on the channel daily. Please support my channel by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thank you very much. Case 2. Teresa Lewis was executed by lethal injection in Virginia, and her case remains one of the most debated death penalty cases in the United States. Teresa Lewis was a wife and a mother who lived in Pittsylvania County, Virginia. In 2002, she became involved in a plan that led to the deaths of her husband, Julian Lewis, and her stepson, Charles Lewis. The killings took place inside the family home. Two men, Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller, entered the house and shot both victims while Teresa Lewis was upstairs. She did not carry out the killings herself, but prosecutors said she planned the crime and helped make it happen. Under Virginia law at that time, planning a murder could result in the death penalty, even if the person did not physically commit the act. Teresa Lewis pleaded guilty to capital murder. The court focused on her role in arranging the crime, including her relationship with one of the men involved and her involvement in setting up the plan. During the trial and later appeals, questions began to grow about her mental ability and whether she fully understood the long-term results of her actions. Court records showed that Teresa Lewis had serious learning problems throughout her life. She left school early, struggled with reading and math, and often depended on others to help her make decisions. Psychological tests later placed her IQ at about 72. This number became very important because of a major U.S. Supreme Court ruling made years earlier, which ruled that people with intellectual disability cannot be executed because it violates the Constitution. However, the court did not set one single national test for intellectual disability. Each state was allowed to decide how to measure it. In Virginia, the legal standard required proof of both low intellectual functioning and serious limits in daily living skills, starting before adulthood. Even though Teresa Lewis's IQ score was close to the commonly discussed cutoff of 70, Virginia courts ruled that she did not meet the state's full legal definition. Judges said she showed enough understanding and planning ability to be held fully responsible under the law. The public reaction to this decision was strong. Many people believed that Teresa Lewis's mental limits made her less blameworthy than the men who carried out the shootings. This belief grew stronger when the sentences of the other two men were examined. Matthew Schallenberger was sentenced to life in prison. Rodney Fuller also received a life sentence, along with extra prison time. Neither man received the death penalty. Critics questioned why the person who planned the crime was executed while the people who pulled the trigger were not. Supporters of the sentence argued that planning and directing the crime showed a high level of responsibility. Opponents argued that her mental ability should have been given greater weight. As Teresa Lewis's execution date approached, appeals were filed in state and federal courts. Lawyers argued that her low IQ, history of abuse, and limited ability to think through consequences should spare her life. Advocacy groups, religious leaders, and international organizations asked Virginia's governor to grant clemency. They did not claim that Teresa Lewis was innocent. Instead, they argued that execution was too harsh given her mental condition and role in the crime. Despite these requests, the courts denied her final appeals, and the governor declined to reduce her sentence. On the night of September 23, 2010, Teresa Lewis was executed at Greensville Correctional Center. She became the first woman executed in Virginia since 1912, and one of a small number of women executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Her execution drew attention far beyond Virginia. News outlets across the country and around the world reported on her case, often focusing on the narrow gap between her IQ score and the legal threshold that might have saved her life. Case 3. Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were two Italian immigrants whose case became one of the most talked about death penalty cases in United States history. Sacco was born in Italy in 1891 and worked as a shoemaker after moving to America. Vanzetti was born in Italy in 1888 and earned a living selling fish. Both men moved to Massachusetts, hoping for better lives. They worked hard, supported their families, and lived quietly. They were also anarchists, which meant they believed the government should have very little power. At that time in America, many people feared immigrants and people with radical political ideas. This fear would play a major role in what happened next. On April 15, 1920, a violent crime shocked the town of South Braintree, Massachusetts. Two men who were carrying factory payroll money were shot and killed during a robbery. The crime caused fear and anger in the community. Police were under pressure to find suspects quickly. A few weeks later, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were arrested. The main reasons were that they were Italian. They carried guns, and they held political views that many Americans disliked. From the start, many people felt the case was moving too fast and without care. The trial took place in 1921. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Witnesses gave confusing and often conflicting stories. Some said the attackers looked Italian, but many could not clearly identify Sacco or Vanzetti. Sacco owned a gun, and prosecutors claimed it was used in the crime, but the science used to test this was new and not reliable by today's standards. Vanzetti had witnesses who said he was selling fish at the time of the robbery, but their statements were questioned because they were also immigrants. The judge made comments that showed dislike for anarchists, which worried many observers. Despite the weak and disputed evidence, the jury found both men guilty. After the conviction, the case did not fade away. Instead, it grew larger and louder. Appeals were filed again and again between 1921 and 1927. Lawyers pointed out problems with the evidence. Some witnesses admitted they had made mistakes. Experts questioned the gun tests. A man already serving time for another crime later claimed his group had carried out the robbery. Even with all this, the courts refused to order a new trial. Each denial increased public concern and anger. Across the United States and around the world, people began to protest. Workers stopped their jobs. Students marched. Writers, teachers, and religious leaders spoke out. Newspapers in Europe and South America covered the case closely. Many believed Sacco and Vanzetti were punished not because the proof was strong, but because they were foreign, poor, and held unpopular beliefs. To supporters, the case became a symbol of injustice. To others, it became a test of whether the legal system could admit mistakes. On August 23, 1927, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were executed in the electric chair at Charlestown State Prison in Massachusetts. Outside the prison, thousands gathered in silence. Some cried, some held signs, many felt helpless. The executions did not end the debate. Instead, questions followed the case for decades. Law schools studied it. Historians wrote books about it. Families of the men continued to speak about their pain and loss. In 1977, 50 years after the executions, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis made an official statement. He said Sacco and Vanzetti had not received a fair trial. He explained that prejudice against immigrants and political beliefs had influenced the case. While this statement did not clear their names legally, it was an important acknowledgement by the state. It showed that the doubts many people had raised were real and serious. If you found this video interesting so far, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for your support. Case 4. George Stinney Jr. was a 14-year-old black boy living in the small mill town of Alkaloo, South Carolina in 1944. He was quiet, young, and still a child. On March 23, 1944, two white girls, Betty June Binnicker, age 11, and Mary Emma Thames, age 7, were found dead in a wooded area near the railroad tracks close to his home. The news shocked the town. Fear spread quickly, and anger followed. Very soon, attention turned toward George. Police officers questioned him without his parents present. He was taken away from his family and held alone. There were no recordings of this questioning. There was no written statement signed by George. Still, police claimed he confessed. From the very beginning, George was treated not as a child, but as someone already judged. George Stinney Jr. was arrested and jailed while his family was forced to leave town for their own safety. His parents were not allowed to see him during questioning. No adult was there to protect him. The case moved forward at a shocking speed. George's trial took place on April 24, 1944. It lasted only one day. The jury was made up of 12 white men. The judge was white. The courtroom was filled with tension, but George sat alone. His court-appointed lawyer did not call witnesses, did not challenge the police claims, and did not present strong evidence to defend him. George's sister later said she was with him at the time of the girls' deaths, but she was never called to testify. No physical evidence connected George to the crime. There were no fingerprints, no blood evidence, and no murder weapon tied to him. The entire case rested on the police's claim that George confessed. After only about 10 minutes of jury discussion, George Stinney Jr. was found guilty. The sentence was death. No appeal was filed on his behalf. In less than 3 months after his arrest, the state prepared to execute a child. On June 16, 1944, George was taken to the electric chair. He was so small that books were placed on the seat to raise his body high enough for the equipment to work. He cried for his parents. At just 14 years old, George became one of the youngest people ever executed in the United States. His life ended before he had a chance to grow up, finish school, or prove his innocence. For many years, George Stinney Jr.'s name was remembered as a symbol of deep injustice. His family never stopped saying he was innocent. Historians, lawyers, and civil rights advocates studied the case again and again. They pointed out the rushed trial, the lack of evidence, the absence of parental support during questioning, and the failure of his lawyer to protect him. They also pointed to the racial divide in the town at that time. Alcolu was separated by race. Black families lived on one side of the tracks. White families lived on the other. Many experts believed fear and racism played a powerful role in how quickly George was blamed and punished. In 2014, 70 years after George's execution, a South Carolina judge reopened the case. The court reviewed transcripts, witness statements, and historical records. On December 16, 2014, the judge ruled that George Stinney Jr. did not receive a fair trial. The court said his legal rights were violated and that the process was deeply flawed. His conviction was officially vacated. While this ruling could not bring George back, it mattered. It cleared his name and confirmed what his family had always said. The justice system failed a child. Case 5. Joe Arity was born in 1915 and grew up with a severe intellectual disability. Medical experts later explained that his thinking ability was similar to that of a very young child. He trusted adults easily, liked simple routines, and wanted to make people happy. Joe did not understand danger, complex questions, or legal rules. These facts are important because they shaped everything that happened to him once the police became involved in his life. In August 1936, a terrible crime shocked the city of Pueblo, Colorado. A 15-year-old girl named Dorothy Drain was raped and murdered. The community was frightened and angry, and the police were under strong pressure to solve the case quickly. Around this time, Joe Arity was found riding a train near Wyoming. He appeared confused and disoriented. Instead of recognizing that Joe needed help, officers arrested him and brought him back to Colorado. Joe was questioned for long periods. He did not have proper legal support during questioning, and no one explained his rights in a way he could understand. During police questioning, officers suggested details of the crime to Joe. Joe repeated those details back, believing he was doing what adults wanted. Police later claimed this was a confession. However, there was no physical evidence connecting Joe to the murder. There were no fingerprints, no reliable witnesses, and no proof placing him at the crime scene. Experts later agreed that Joe did not have the mental ability to give a meaningful confession or understand what he was saying. His disability made him highly suggestible and unable to protect himself during questioning. Another man, Frank Aguilar, was also arrested for the same crime. Aguilar confessed and provided details that matched the evidence. A surviving victim identified Aguilar as the attacker. Aguilar was convicted and executed in 1937. Despite this, the state continued to prosecute Joe Arity. The case against Joe did not improve. The confession remained the main piece of evidence. At trial, doctors explained that Joe had a very low IQ and could not fully understand questions or consequences. These facts were presented, but they did not stop the trial from moving forward. Joe Arity did not understand the courtroom process. People who watched the trial later said he smiled at times because he believed everything would be okay. He thought he was helping and did not realize his life was in danger. The jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death. Joe was sent to the Colorado State Penitentiary in Canyon City. On death row, guards noticed that Joe behaved differently from other prisoners. He was calm, friendly, and trusting. He spent time playing with a toy train and waving at people. He did not understand what death row meant or what execution involved. Even the prison warden believed Joe Arity was innocent and asked the state to show mercy. Requests were made to stop the execution, but they were denied. On January 6, 1939, Joe Arity was taken to the gas chamber. Witnesses later said he walked quietly and calmly. He believed he was going somewhere safe. Joe was 23 years old when the state carried out his execution. At the time, officials did not publicly admit doubts about his guilt, even though many people involved believed a grave mistake had been made. For many years, Joe Aridy's case received little attention. Over time, historians, lawyers, and disability advocates began to study it carefully. They found serious problems. Joe's confession was unreliable. His intellectual disability made him unable to understand legal danger or defend himself. Records suggested that Joe may not even have been in Pueblo when the crime happened. Experts agreed that modern legal standards would not allow someone with Joe's level of disability to be questioned, tried, or executed in the way he was. In 2011, more than 70 years after Joe Aridy's execution, the state of Colorado formally addressed the injustice. Governor Bill Ritter Jr. granted Joe Aridy a full and unconditional posthumous pardon. This was the first pardon of its kind in Colorado history. The governor stated that Joe Aridy was very likely innocent and that his conviction was based on a false confession and an unfair legal process. While the pardon could not undo Joe's death, it cleared his name and restored his dignity. Case 6. Kenneth Eugene Smith became a central figure in one of the most debated death penalty cases in modern United States history because Alabama used a new execution method that had never been carried out on a human before. Smith was convicted for his role in the 1988 murder-for-hire killing of Elizabeth Dorleen Sennett in Alabama. She was the wife of a Church of Christ minister. Prosecutors said Smith was paid to help carry out the killing. After years of appeals, his case returned to public attention for a very different reason. The state of Alabama decided to change how it would carry out his death sentence, and that decision shocked many people. In November 2022, Alabama attempted to execute Kenneth Eugene Smith using lethal injection. The effort failed. Prison staff tried for hours to place intravenous lines into his body. Smith was strapped to a gurney while attempts continued. Witnesses later described how long the process took and how distressing it appeared. Eventually, the state called off the execution. Smith was returned to his cell alive. This event caused strong reactions across the country. Many people asked how a state could try to kill someone and fail, yet still plan another attempt later. After the failed execution, Alabama announced it would seek to use nitrogen hypoxia instead of lethal injection. Nitrogen hypoxia works by replacing oxygen with nitrogen gas. Without oxygen, the body cannot survive. State officials claimed this method would be fast and cause little suffering. Medical experts and human rights groups disagreed. They warned that the method had never been used on a human being for execution and had not been tested in real conditions. Legal teams argued that using an untested method raised serious risks. Smith's lawyers went to court to stop the execution. They argued that using nitrogen gas violated the Constitution's ban on cruel punishment. They also said that trying to execute Smith again after the failed lethal injection attempt was unfair. Courts reviewed these arguments at several levels. Federal judges and the U.S. Supreme Court declined to block the execution. This cleared the way for Alabama to move forward. On January 25, 2024, Alabama executed Kenneth Eugene Smith using nitrogen hypoxia at William C. Holman Correctional Facility. Smith became the first person in U.S. history to be executed using this method. Witnesses were allowed to observe. Reports described Smith breathing heavily, shaking, and remaining conscious for several minutes before death occurred. The execution lasted longer than state officials had suggested it would. These observations quickly spread through news reports and social media. The reaction was immediate and intense. Some lawmakers said the execution crossed a line. Medical professionals said the method raised serious ethical questions. Human rights groups inside and outside the United States criticized the decision. The United Nations warned that nitrogen hypoxia could be cruel and should not be used. Even people who support the death penalty said the case made them uneasy. Several states with death penalty laws began watching closely, unsure whether to follow Alabama's example. Case 7. Darlie Routier, a woman from Rowlett, Texas, whose death penalty case has remained one of the most debated and emotionally charged cases in the United States for nearly 3 decades. On the early morning of June 6, 1996, Darlie Routier called 911 from her home and reported a violent attack. She said an unknown intruder had broken into the house and stabbed her and her 2 young sons while they slept. When police arrived, they found 5-year-old Damon Routier dead at the scene. His older brother, Devin Routier, who was 6 years old, was rushed to the hospital but later died from his injuries. Darlie Routier survived with serious wounds to her neck, arms, and chest. From the beginning, the case raised difficult questions. Darlie Routier told police she had been asleep on the couch when she woke up to a struggle. She said she fought the attacker and chased him out of the house before collapsing from her injuries. Investigators, however, began to question her account. Prosecutors later argued that the crime scene showed signs of being staged. They pointed to bloodstain patterns, the placement of a knife, and a sock found in a nearby alley that belonged to the family. According to the state, these details did not fully support the story of an outside intruder. In 1997, Darlie Routier was put on trial for the capital murder of Damon Routier. Under Texas law, she was charged only for Damon's death, even though both boys were killed during the same incident. After weeks of testimony, a jury found her guilty. She was sentenced to death later that year. Her husband, Darren Routier, was never charged with any crime. The state has also never brought Darlie Routier to trial for Devin's death, though prosecutors have publicly said they believe she was responsible. The controversy around the case grew stronger after the trial ended. Supporters of Darlie Routier argue that the forensic evidence was misunderstood or overstated. They point to her neck wound, which came close to a major artery, and say it was serious and life-threatening. Medical experts have disagreed on whether such an injury could have been self-inflicted. Supporters also argue that blood evidence was interpreted using methods that were common in the 1990s but are now considered outdated. They believe newer testing and analysis could offer a clearer picture of what truly happened inside the house that night. One of the most publicized moments from the trial involved a short video shown to the jury. The video showed Darlie Routier at a cemetery 8 days after the deaths, spraying silly string during what was meant to be a birthday visit for Damon. Prosecutors used the clip to argue that her behavior showed a lack of grief. Supporters argue the video was misleading and that it did not show the private moments of mourning that happened before the recording. This footage played a powerful role in shaping how many people viewed her as a mother and as a defendant. Over the years, Darlie Routier has remained on Texas's death row, while her legal team has continued to appeal her conviction. Her lawyers have asked courts to allow expanded DNA testing on evidence from the scene, including the knife and other items. Courts have approved limited testing, but not all the testing her defense requested. So far, the results have not overturned her conviction. Still, legal efforts continue, and supporters say the full story has not yet been told through modern science. As of today, Darlie Routier remains alive on death row in Texas. She has consistently maintained her innocence and says she did not harm her children. Her case is frequently discussed in books, documentaries, and legal debates because it touches on deep issues involving forensic science, courtroom perception, and how juries judge behavior after tragedy. Case 8. Willie McGee worked as a truck driver and lived in the Deep South during the Jim Crow era, a time when racial separation was enforced by law and black people were often treated unfairly in courts. In 1945, Willie McGee was accused of raping a white woman. He said the relationship was secret and consensual. The woman said she was attacked. From the beginning, the case was shaped by fear, race, and public pressure, rather than calm judgment. Willie McGee was arrested and brought to trial in Mississippi, where the legal system heavily favored white citizens. His trial was held before an all-white jury. His lawyers had little time and few resources to prepare a defense. There was no physical evidence presented that clearly proved rape. The case relied mainly on testimony. At that time, accusations involving black men and white women almost always led to harsh punishment, no matter how weak the evidence was. The courtroom atmosphere was tense, and many people believed the verdict was decided before the trial even began. Willie McGee was found guilty and sentenced to death. This decision shocked many who followed the case closely. Over the next several years, his lawyers filed appeal after appeal. They argued that the trial had been unfair, that racism played a major role, and that public pressure influenced the jury. These appeals did not focus on small technical issues. They focused on the larger problem of justice in a system built on inequality. Each appeal raised hope that the sentence would be overturned, but Mississippi courts repeatedly rejected them. As the case continued, Willie McGee's story spread far beyond Mississippi. Civil rights groups took up his cause. Writers, activists, and legal scholars spoke out. International attention followed. People from outside the United States also questioned how a country that claimed to value freedom could allow such a case to end in death. The Civil Rights Congress led large efforts to stop the execution. Letters were sent to state officials. Protests were organized. Many believed that Willie McGee was facing execution not because of solid proof, but because of his race and the time in which he lived. The length of time Willie McGee spent on death row also became part of the controversy. His execution was delayed several times, which was unusual. Each delay came after public pressure or legal action. Each delay also meant more emotional strain. Supporters believed these delays showed that even the courts were unsure. Critics of the death penalty pointed to the delays as proof that the case was deeply troubled. Still, the state of Mississippi refused to grant a new trial or show mercy. On May 8, 1951, Willie McGee was executed in the gas chamber at Mississippi State Penitentiary, also known as Parchman Farm. He maintained his innocence until the end. His death caused anger and sadness across the country. Newspapers reported on the execution as a symbol of racial injustice. For many Black Americans, the case confirmed their fear that the justice system did not protect them equally. For others, it became a wake-up call about the dangers of capital punishment. Case 9. Dobie Gillis Williams' case is still discussed today because of serious questions about his intellectual ability and whether the justice system truly understood his limitations before making a final decision. His execution happened just a few years before U.S. law changed to protect people with intellectual disabilities from being put to death. Dobie Gillis Williams was born in 1961 and grew up in deep poverty in rural Louisiana. From a very young age, he struggled to learn. In school, he had trouble reading, writing, and following lessons. Teachers described him as slow to understand simple ideas. As he grew older, these struggles did not go away. Friends and family members said he often depended on others to help him make decisions. He had difficulty understanding rules, consequences, and complex conversations. Psychological testing later showed that his intelligence level was very low and close to the range used by experts to define intellectual disability. In 1984, Williams was arrested for the murder of Mary Mae Wilder, an elderly woman who was found dead inside her home in Red River Parish, Louisiana. The crime was serious and disturbing, and it shocked the local community. Williams confessed to the crime during police questioning. Supporters later argued that his mental limitations made it hard for him to fully understand his rights during the interrogation. At the time, however, the confession was accepted by the court, and it became a major part of the case against him. Williams went to trial facing the death penalty. During the trial, the prosecution focused heavily on the confession and the details of the crime. The defense team did not clearly explain Williams's intellectual limitations to the jury. His lawyers failed to present strong expert testimony that could have shown how his low intelligence affected his thinking, judgment, and ability to understand what was happening around him. Because of this, the jury never fully heard how limited his mental abilities were or how vulnerable he was inside the legal system. Williams was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. As the years passed, new lawyers raised concerns during appeals. Mental health experts explained that Williams struggled with understanding complex ideas, solving problems, and helping in his own defense. They argued that his mental condition should have been fully explained during the trial. Courts reviewed these arguments but ruled that Williams did not meet the strict legal definition required at the time to stop an execution based on intellectual disability. Under the rules that existed before 2002, states were allowed to execute people with intellectual disabilities. On January 8, 1999, Dobie Gillis Williams was executed by lethal injection at the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. His execution happened quietly, but the questions surrounding his case did not fade. Just 3 years later, in 2002, the United States Supreme Court made a major ruling. The court decided that executing people with intellectual disabilities violates the Constitution. This ruling changed the death penalty law across the country. Sadly, it came too late to protect Williams. Williams's case became an important example used by death penalty critics and disability rights advocates. They pointed to how his mental limitations were not properly presented to the jury, and how the legal system failed to protect someone who struggled to understand his situation. Advocates argued that if Williams had been tried under the rules that exist today, his execution would not have been allowed. Case 10. Marcellus Khalifa Williams was convicted for the 1998 killing of Felicia Gale, a former newspaper reporter who was found stabbed to death inside her home in St. Louis County, Missouri. From the start, the case raised serious questions. There was no physical evidence that placed Williams at the crime scene. No fingerprints, no hair, and no blood evidence matched him. Even so, the state moved forward with a case that relied heavily on witness statements that many later said were unreliable. The crime happened on August 11, 1998. Neighbors became worried when Felicia Gale did not show up for work and her home looked unusual. Police later found her body inside. The investigation quickly focused on Marcellus Williams, a man with a prior criminal record who lived in the area. Williams denied killing Gale. At trial, prosecutors did not present DNA evidence tying him to the murder. Instead, they relied on two key witnesses. One was a former girlfriend who said Williams confessed to her. The other was a jailhouse informant who claimed Williams admitted the crime while they were locked up together. Over time, it became clear that both witnesses had reasons to testify. One received money and the other received help with his own legal problems. These details mattered because the jury never heard strong physical proof. Years later, the knife believed to be the murder weapon was tested. The results did not help the state's case. DNA found on the knife did not belong to Marcellus Williams. Testing showed that the DNA came from other sources, including contamination by people who handled the knife after it was collected. This raised even more concern. If the weapon did not connect Williams to the crime, many asked why the sentence still stood. Other forensic items from the scene, such as hairs and footprints, also failed to match him. Williams continued to say he was innocent. His legal team asked courts to look again at the evidence. In 2017, Missouri's governor at the time stopped an execution date and ordered a special review because of concerns about the case. That review later ended without clearing Williams, but the doubts remained. What made the case even more unusual was the position taken by local prosecutors years later. St. Louis County prosecuting attorney Wesley Bell said the evidence used to convict Williams was deeply flawed. Bell filed motions asking courts to set aside the conviction and death sentence, arguing that justice was not served when DNA evidence pointed away from the condemned person. As time passed, support for Williams grew. Some jurors from the original trial said they would not have voted for death if they had known all the facts. Faith leaders, civil rights groups, and legal experts also raised alarms. While in prison, Williams converted to Islam and took the name Khalifa. He spent years writing poetry and mentoring other inmates. To supporters, this showed growth and humanity. To critics of the execution, it showed the risk of taking a life when serious doubt still exists. In 2024, the case reached a final and painful moment. Despite the DNA findings and the request from the local prosecutor to stop the execution, Missouri courts allowed the sentence to move forward. Appeals were filed up to the last day. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene. On September 24, 2024, Marcellus Khalifa Williams was executed by lethal injection at the state prison in Potosi, Missouri. He maintained his innocence until the end. His execution happened even though the murder weapon did not contain his DNA and even though the case depended on testimony that many believed could not be trusted. Williams's case sparked national debate. People asked hard questions. How much proof should be required before the state takes a life? What happens when DNA evidence raises doubt after a conviction? Should testimony from informants who receive benefits be enough to decide a person's fate? These questions became louder because the execution could not be reversed. Once it happened, the chance to correct a mistake was gone. Case 11. Richard Glossip is an Oklahoma death row prisoner whose case has become one of the most controversial death penalty cases in the United States because of serious and long-lasting questions about fairness, evidence, and reliability. Glossip was sentenced to death for the 1997 murder of motel owner Barry Van Treese in Oklahoma City. From the moment he was arrested, Glossip said he did not kill anyone and did not plan the crime. More than 25 years later, his case is still being debated by courts, lawmakers, and legal experts across the country. The crime happened in January 1997 at the Best Budget Inn, a motel owned by Barry Van Treese. Van Treese was found beaten to death in one of the rooms. Police quickly focused on two men who worked at the motel: Richard Glossip, the manager, and Justin Sneed, a maintenance worker. Justin Sneed admitted that he killed Van Treese by striking him with a baseball bat. Sneed told police he acted alone at first. Later, after talking with prosecutors, he changed his story and said Glossip paid him to commit the murder. This change became the foundation of the case against Glossip. At trial, prosecutors argued that Glossip planned the killing to avoid being fired by Van Treese. However, there was no physical evidence tying Glossip to the murder. No DNA, no fingerprints, no weapon connected to him. The case relied almost completely on Justin Sneed's testimony. In return for testifying against Glossip, Sneed avoided the death penalty and received a sentence of life in prison. The jury was never fully told how much Sneed gained from blaming Glossip, which later became a major concern. Over the years, Glossip's lawyers uncovered troubling details. They argued that prosecutors failed to share important evidence with the defense. This included information about Justin Sneed's mental health history, his drug use, and his past violent behavior. Some evidence was reported missing or destroyed. These details could have helped the jury understand that Sneed had strong reasons to lie. Courts repeatedly reviewed these claims, but Glossip remained on death row. Justin Sneed's credibility continued to weaken over time. He gave different versions of events in separate statements. His story changed about why the murder happened and how it was planned. Each change raised new questions about whether his testimony could be trusted. Despite this, Glossip was scheduled for execution multiple times. Each time, new legal issues or evidence stopped the execution at the last moment. What makes Richard Glossip's case stand out is the wide range of people who later spoke out for him. Conservative and liberal lawmakers joined together to ask for a new trial. Former judges and prosecutors reviewed the case and said it showed signs of a wrongful conviction. Religious leaders and legal scholars also raised concerns. This level of agreement across political lines is rare in death penalty cases. In 2023, the case took a dramatic turn. Oklahoma's Republican Attorney General reviewed the record and publicly stated that Richard Glossip did not receive a fair trial. The Attorney General asked the courts to allow a new trial, saying the conviction could not be trusted because of withheld evidence and unreliable testimony. This was a striking moment because it came from the same office that had once argued for Glossip's execution. Richard Glossip has spent decades living under the threat of death. He has been moved back and forth between execution dates and court hearings. Each delay brought relief, followed by more uncertainty. Case 12. Troy Davis was a man from Savannah, Georgia, whose death penalty case became one of the most debated and discussed cases in the history of capital punishment in the United States. Troy Davis was accused of killing Officer Mark Allen McPhail, an off-duty police officer, during the early morning hours of August 19, 1989. The shooting happened near a Burger King parking lot, where Officer McPhail had gone to help a homeless man who was being attacked. The officer was shot and later died from his injuries. This single event would lead to a long legal battle that lasted more than 20 years and drew attention from people around the world. Troy Davis was arrested months after the shooting. There was no gun found that could be linked to him. There was no DNA evidence, no fingerprints, and no physical proof tying him directly to the crime scene. The case against him depended almost entirely on eyewitness testimony. Several people told police they saw Troy Davis near the scene or claimed he admitted guilt later. In 1991, a Georgia jury found Troy Davis guilty of murder and sentenced him to death. From the start, questions were raised about how reliable the witness statements were, especially since the case had no physical evidence to support them. As the years passed, the case became more complicated. 7 of the 9 key witnesses who testified against Troy Davis later changed their stories or said their earlier statements were not true. Some witnesses said they felt pressured by police during questioning. Others said they were afraid or confused at the time of the trial. A few witnesses later said they believed another man may have been the shooter. These changes caused serious concern among Troy Davis's supporters, who argued that a conviction based mainly on eyewitness accounts should be reviewed when those accounts no longer matched the original trial testimony. Despite these developments, Georgia courts repeatedly refused to grant Troy Davis a new trial. Judges ruled that the witness changes did not meet the strict legal standard required to overturn a conviction. As a result, Troy Davis remained on death row for many years. During this time, his case began to attract national and international attention. Human rights groups, religious leaders, former prosecutors, and even some former law enforcement officials spoke out. Millions of people signed petitions asking that his execution be stopped. Public demonstrations were held across the United States and in other countries. In 2009, the case reached a rare and important moment. The United States Supreme Court ordered a special evidentiary hearing to examine the new witness statements. This type of order was extremely uncommon, especially in a death penalty case that had already gone through many appeals. The court described Troy Davis's situation as unusual and serious. The hearing took place in federal court, where judges reviewed the updated testimony. Even after hearing the new evidence, the court ruled that Troy Davis had not proven his innocence under the very high legal standard required. The death sentence remained in place. As Troy Davis's execution date approached, public pressure grew even stronger. Protests took place outside the prison where he was held and in cities around the world. Many people believed that executing a man without physical evidence and with so many witness changes was too great a risk. Others believed the courts had already reviewed the case enough times and that the conviction should stand. The country was deeply divided, and the case became a symbol in the debate over whether the death penalty can ever be applied fairly. On September 21, 2011, Troy Davis was executed by lethal injection at a Georgia prison. In his final statement, he maintained his innocence. He spoke to the family of Officer McPhail and expressed sorrow for their loss, while also stating that he did not commit the crime. As the execution took place, protests continued outside the prison gates and across the world. News outlets covered the moment live, and many people watched with disbelief and sadness. Case 13. Nathaniel Wood's case became one of the most controversial death penalty cases in modern U.S. history. Nathaniel Woods was a black man from Birmingham, Alabama, and a father of 2 young children. His story gained national attention because he was sentenced to death for the killing of 3 police officers, even though he did not fire the fatal shots. The case forced many people to stop and think about how responsibility is decided in the justice system and how far the death penalty should go. Nathaniel Woods' case began on June 17, 2004. On that day, Birmingham police officers went to an apartment building to serve an arrest warrant on another man named Cary Spencer. Nathaniel Woods was inside the apartment with Spencer. When officers approached, gunfire broke out. Cary Spencer fired the shots that killed 3 officers, Carlos Owen, Harley Chisholm, and Charles Bennett. These deaths shocked the city and caused deep pain for the families of the officers and the wider community. No one disputed who fired the gun. Cary Spencer admitted he was the shooter. Nathaniel Woods did not have a gun and did not shoot anyone. Even so, prosecutors said he played a role in what happened. They argued that Nathaniel Woods knew the police were coming and helped create the situation that led to the shootings. Under Alabama law at the time, a person could be sentenced to death if they were found to have helped or supported a crime that resulted in murder, even if they did not pull the trigger. This legal rule became one of the central reasons the case later caused so much debate. At trial, a jury found Nathaniel Woods guilty of capital murder. During sentencing, the jury voted 10-2 in favor of the death penalty. Alabama law did not require all jurors to agree for a death sentence. Many people found this troubling, especially because the punishment was permanent. Supporters of Nathaniel Woods argued that a decision to take a life should require full agreement from the jury. At the time, Alabama was one of the few states that allowed death sentences without a unanimous jury recommendation. Over the years, questions about the evidence continued to grow. Supporters of Nathaniel Woods said there was no proof that he planned the killings or wanted the officers harmed. Carrie Spencer gave statements saying Nathaniel Woods did not tell him to shoot the police. Lawyers argued that the case relied on assumptions rather than direct evidence. They said the punishment did not fit Nathaniel Woods' actual actions. These concerns turned the case into a rallying point for people who wanted changes to death penalty laws. As the execution date came closer, public attention increased. Civil rights groups, faith leaders, lawmakers, and well-known public figures asked Alabama officials to stop the execution. Many of them said their concern was not about excusing violence or forgetting the officers who died. Their concern was about fairness and whether the death penalty should be used in a case where the person executed was not the shooter. Petitions gathered thousands of signatures. Protests were held. Calls for mercy grew louder. Nathaniel Woods' lawyers filed last-minute appeals in state and federal courts. They argued that his execution would be unjust and that the jury's vote did not meet modern standards of fairness. The courts reviewed these requests but denied them. A clemency request was also sent to Alabama's governor. That request was denied as well. Despite the widespread support and growing public concern, the execution was allowed to move forward. On the evening of March 5, 2020, Nathaniel Woods was executed by lethal injection at Holman Correctional Facility. His execution happened just hours after final appeals were rejected. His death marked the end of a long legal battle, but not the end of the conversation. For many people, the case continued to raise serious questions about how guilt is measured and how punishment is decided. After Nathaniel Woods' execution, his case remained part of discussions about death penalty reform. Alabama later changed its law to require unanimous jury recommendations for death sentences. But the change did not apply to cases like his. Many people pointed to his execution as an example of why those changes were needed. Others believed the law was applied correctly as it existed at the time. The debate showed how divided the public remains on capital punishment. Case 14. Cameron Todd Willingham was convicted of setting a house fire that killed his 3 young daughters, but years later, experts raised serious doubts about the fire evidence used to send him to death row. His case is often discussed today because it shows how faulty science can shape life and death decisions inside a courtroom. Cameron Todd Willingham lived with his wife and children in Corsicana, Texas. On the night of December 23, 1991, a fire broke out inside their home. Willingham escaped the burning house with injuries to his arms and head. His 3 daughters, Amber, Cameron, and Carmen, were trapped inside and died in the fire. The loss shocked the community. Fire investigators arrived soon after and quickly concluded that the blaze had been set on purpose. From the very beginning, the case focused on the idea that the fire was arson. Investigators pointed to burn marks on the floor, cracks in the glass, and fire patterns they believed showed the use of an accelerant. At the time, these signs were commonly accepted as proof of arson. Willingham was arrested and charged with capital murder. At his trial in 1992, prosecutors relied heavily on this fire analysis. There was no physical evidence linking Willingham to setting the fire, but the jury was told the fire science was reliable. Willingham denied starting the fire and said it was an accident. Despite this, he was convicted and sentenced to death. As Willingham spent years on death row, fire science began to change. Researchers and experts started to show that many traditional arson indicators were incorrect. Burn patterns once thought to prove arson were later found to appear in accidental fires. Cracked glass could be caused by heat, not accelerants. What had once been treated as solid proof was being questioned across the country. These changes raised concerns about older arson cases, including Willingham's. Shortly before his execution, a well-known fire expert, Dr. Gerald Hurst, reviewed the evidence in Willingham's case. In 2004, Dr. Hurst concluded that the fire evidence did not support a finding of arson. He warned Texas officials that the investigation relied on outdated and incorrect ideas about fire behavior. His report stated that there was no reliable proof that the fire was intentionally set. Despite these warnings, the execution was not stopped. Cameron Todd Willingham was executed by lethal injection on February 17, 2004, at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He maintained his innocence until his death. After his execution, the controversy surrounding his case continued to grow. Journalists, scientists, and legal experts began to examine the case more closely. Many questioned whether Texas had executed a man based on faulty science. In 2009, the Texas Forensic Science Commission reviewed the Willingham case. A report prepared for the commission concluded that the original fire investigation did not meet modern scientific standards. The review found that the methods used by the investigators were unreliable and unsupported by current fire science. While the commission did not officially declare Willingham innocent, it confirmed that the evidence used to convict him was deeply flawed. The case drew national attention through investigative reporting, especially a detailed examination published by The New Yorker. These reports explained how outdated forensic methods had influenced the jury and how expert warnings were ignored. The case became a central example in discussions about wrongful convictions and the risks of using untested science in criminal trials. Case 15. Karla Faye Tucker became one of the most controversial figures in the history of the death penalty in the United States, not because of doubt about her guilt, but because of what happened to her after her conviction. Karla was born in 1959 and grew up in a difficult environment marked by drugs, instability, and abuse. By her early 20s, she was deeply involved in heavy drug use and criminal behavior. In June 1983, when she was 23 years old, Karla took part in a violent crime in Houston, Texas, that would change many lives forever. Two people, Jerry Lynn Dean and Deborah Thornton, were brutally killed during a robbery. The weapon used was a pickaxe. The crime shocked the community because of its violence and cruelty. Karla Faye Tucker did not deny her role in the murders. She admitted what she had done and spoke openly about her actions. At trial, the jury heard about the crime, her involvement, and her behavior at the time. Texas law allowed the death penalty for crimes like this, and Karla was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. There was no serious dispute about whether she committed the crime. The court process focused on punishment, not innocence. Karla was sent to death row, where she would spend many years waiting for her execution. While in prison, something unexpected happened. During the late 1980s, Karla Faye Tucker experienced a strong religious conversion. She became a Christian and said that her faith completely changed how she saw herself and the world. She stopped using drugs, followed prison rules, and became known for calm behavior. Prison staff, chaplains, and people who visited her said she showed deep regret for her actions. Karla spoke often about responsibility and forgiveness. She wrote letters, prayed regularly, and tried to support other inmates. Over time, many people believed she was no longer the same person who committed the murders in 1983. News of Karla's transformation spread far beyond the prison walls. Journalists wrote stories about her change. Religious leaders spoke about her case in churches and public forums. Supporters did not say the crime was acceptable. Instead, they asked a different question. If a person truly changes and shows remorse, should the state still carry out an execution years later? This question became the heart of the controversy. Karla's case turned into a national conversation about redemption, rehabilitation, and punishment. As her execution date drew closer, the debate grew stronger. Karla Faye Tucker became especially significant because she was set to be the first woman executed in Texas since the Civil War. Appeals for mercy came from many places. Religious leaders across different faiths spoke out. Human rights groups asked for her sentence to be changed to life in prison. Even Pope John Paul II publicly appealed for clemency. These voices argued that Karla's life in prison showed proof of change, and that execution would ignore that reality. On the other side, Texas officials and prosecutors held firm. They argued that the law had been followed correctly. They said punishment was based on the crime, not on later behavior. Courts reviewed Karla's appeals but found no legal reason to stop the execution. Texas Governor George W. Bush denied clemency, stating that the justice system had worked as intended. For many supporters of the death penalty, this decision reinforced the idea that punishment should remain consistent, regardless of personal transformation. On February 3, 1998, Carla Faye Tucker was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She was 38 years old. In her final statement, she expressed remorse for the pain she caused and spoke about her faith. Her execution marked a historic moment. She became the first woman executed in Texas in more than a century. The event drew national and international attention and left the public deeply divided. After her death, the debate did not end. Carla Faye Tucker's case continues to be discussed in schools, legal studies, churches, and discussions about the death penalty. Some people believe justice was served because the punishment matched the crime. Others believe the system failed to consider human growth and change. Her case is often used to explore whether the death penalty should allow room for mercy when someone shows clear rehabilitation. Case 16. Larry Griffin's execution later became one of the most disturbing examples raised in discussions about wrongful death penalty cases in the United States. Larry Griffin was executed by the state of Missouri on June 6, 1995, for a murder that happened 15 years earlier in 1980. At the time of his execution, courts believed the case had been fully reviewed. Years later, careful investigations would point in a very different direction, raising serious questions about whether Missouri put an innocent man to death. The crime took place during a late-night shooting in St. Louis. A man was killed, and police were under pressure to find a suspect quickly. Larry Griffin was arrested and charged with the murder, even though the case against him was thin from the start. There was no physical evidence tying Griffin to the crime. No gun was linked to him. No fingerprints placed him at the scene. No forensic testing connected him to the victim. Instead, the prosecution's case depended almost entirely on the testimony of one person. That person became known as the case's key witness. He was a career criminal who had his own legal problems. In exchange for his testimony against Larry Griffin, he received favorable treatment from authorities. At trial, prosecutors presented him as a reliable eyewitness who claimed Larry Griffin was involved in the murder. The defense argued that this witness could not be trusted and pointed out that Griffin had an alibi. Despite these warnings, the jury believed the witness and returned a guilty verdict. Larry Griffin was sentenced to death and sent to Missouri's death row. Over the years, his lawyers filed appeals, arguing that the conviction was unsafe because it rested on unreliable testimony and lacked physical proof. These appeals were denied. Courts ruled that the jury had already weighed the evidence and that no legal errors justified a new trial. As a result, Larry Griffin remained on death row while the clock moved steadily toward his execution date. On June 6, 1995, Missouri carried out Larry Griffin's execution by lethal injection. At that moment, the case was officially closed in the eyes of the justice system. There was no chance left for new hearings or new evidence to be heard in court. For Griffin's family, the execution ended all legal hope. For the public, the case quietly faded from attention. After Griffin's death, new information began to emerge. The same key witness who had testified against him later admitted that he had lied. He stated clearly that Larry Griffin was not present at the murder scene. This admission came too late to help Griffin, but it raised alarming questions about how the conviction had happened in the first place. If the central testimony was false, the foundation of the entire case collapsed. The NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund launched a detailed investigation into Larry Griffin's case. Their review went beyond the trial record and looked closely at police reports, witness statements, and overlooked leads. The results were deeply troubling. The NAACP investigation concluded that Larry Griffin was innocent of the murder for which he was executed. Investigators found evidence pointing toward other possible suspects, individuals who were never fully pursued by law enforcement at the time. The investigation also highlighted how the justice system failed to properly question the credibility of the star witness. His criminal background and the benefits he received were not given enough weight. The lack of physical evidence should have raised serious doubts, yet the case moved forward anyway. These findings suggested that Larry Griffin's execution was not just a tragic outcome, but a profound failure of the system meant to protect the innocent. Larry Griffin's case is especially painful because the truth came after his death. Unlike cases where new evidence leads to release or exoneration, there was no way to correct this mistake. Missouri could not undo what had been done. His family was left with unanswered questions, and the state was left with a permanent decision that could never be reversed. Case 17. Napoleon Beasley was only 17 years old when the crime happened. He grew up in Dallas, Texas, in a difficult environment and had a troubled teenage life. At that age, he was still legally a child. Even so, the state of Texas later chose to execute him as an adult. His death would come just a few years before the United States changed the law on juvenile executions. The crime occurred in 1994. Napoleon Beasley was involved in a carjacking that led to the killing of John Luddig, a 63-year-old retired Air Force colonel. Luddig was also the father of a future federal judge. The killing shocked the community. Beasley was not the person who fired the gun that killed Luddig. Another young man pulled the trigger. Prosecutors argued that Beasley played an important role in the crime and should be held just as responsible. Under Texas law at the time, a person who was 17 when a crime happened could receive the death penalty. A jury agreed with the prosecution and sentenced Beasley to death for capital murder. As Beasley sat on death row, his case began to draw attention. Supporters pointed to his age at the time of the crime. They said teenagers do not think the same way adults do. Brain development is still ongoing, and young people are more likely to act without fully understanding the results of their actions. These arguments were supported by psychologists and medical experts. Many people also pointed to Beasley's behavior in prison. During his years on death row, he earned a GED, learned to read and write better, and showed signs of growth and regret. Prison staff reported that he followed rules and helped others when he could. Over time, faith leaders, human rights groups, and anti-death penalty activists began to speak out. They asked Texas officials to show mercy. Petitions were sent to the governor. Letters were written by people who believed Beasley had changed. They argued that executing someone for a crime committed as a teenager was wrong. Despite these efforts, the courts continued to uphold the sentence. Judges ruled that the law in place at the time allowed the execution and that Beasley's conviction followed legal rules. Napoleon Beasley was executed on May 28, 2002, at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was 25 years old. The method was lethal injection. News of his execution spread quickly. Many people reacted with anger and sadness. Critics said the state ignored the growing national concern about juvenile executions. Supporters of the sentence argued that the crime was serious and deserved the harshest punishment allowed by law. What made Beasley's case even more painful for many was what happened later. In 2005, just 3 years after his execution, the United States Supreme Court decided, in a ruling, the court said it was unconstitutional to execute people for crimes committed under the age of 18. The decision was based on new understanding of brain development, fairness, and evolving standards of decency. The ruling saved dozens of people on death row across the country. It came too late for Napoleon Beasley. The timing of Beasley's death became the center of the controversy. Many people asked a simple question. If his execution had been delayed a little longer, would he still be alive? If you enjoyed watching this death row documentary, please subscribe to my channel. I create and post interesting true crime videos on the channel daily. Thank you for watching.